Thank you all for being here for our final panel of this two-day conference on conscience. It's been a very intense, very, very rich 2 days. I think we all have a lot to think about, maybe once we recover from this amount of thought. But we're closing with a panel that's very important to me in particular. It's a roundtable format on conscientious objection, or the question of conscientious objection. We have 3 panelists, and I'll get started. Nancy is on her way. She had to step out to run a quick errand, but she'll be here very soon. So our first presenter is going to be Colonel Stephen Kleinman. Stephen Kleinman is a senior intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force. He's a widely recognized subject matter expert with extensive experience in human intelligence operations, special operations, strategic interrogation, and resistance to interrogation. He served as senior advisor to the Intelligence Science Board study in Educing Information, which issued guidelines for improving the government's interrogation techniques. Colonel Kleinman powerfully shaped awareness and revision of the tacit acceptance of the use of torture when he publicly opposed enhanced interrogation techniques for battling the war on terror in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Judiciary Committee. He's made a strong case against the use of torture in articles published in the law reviews of the City University of New York and Valparaiso University Law Schools, and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. Our second panelist, Eyal, is an author and journalist based in New York. He's a contributor to a number of journals, among them The Nation, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, Mother Jones, and the Atlantic Monthly, to name only a few. His books include Beautiful Souls, Saying No, Breaking Ranks, and Heeding the Voice of Conscience in Dark Times, and Absolute Convictions. Our third panelist, Yusef Komunyakaa, is a world-renowned poet and global distinguished professor of English at NYU. He's written extensively and profoundly out of his experience of the South in the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and out of his experience of service in the U.S. Army during Vietnam. He's a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, to name only one of his major awards, and his collections include The Chameleon Couch, Taboo, the Wishbone Trilogy, Pleasure Dome, and too many other collections to name here, all of which have been hugely awarded and recognized. Our Stanford moderator is Debra Satz, Associate Dean of Humanities, Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics and Society, Professor of Philosophy, and by courtesy Political Science, and Research Affiliate for the Program on Global Justice. Before I hand the mic over to Stephen Kleinman, he asked me to read an excerpt from Jane Mayer's book, The Dark Side, as a way of situating his remarks. But while the Iraq Survey Group rejected Washington's pressure to use SERE techniques, which is survival, evasion, resistance, and escape techniques, another task force based in Iraq was excited at the prospect. The Pentagon report found that in September 2003, with the encouragement of the U.S. Joint Forces Command, SERE advisors were sent to aid one of the special new secretive commando teams in Iraq, known as the Joint Task Force 20, or TF-20. The task force's commander, the report showed, did not call on SERE to help protect his soldiers, but rather asked the SERE officials to provide assistance, to quote, provide advice and assistance to the task force interrogation mission. Within months of the JPRA delegation visit, TF-20 developed a reputation for uncontrolled brutality. A confidential report to the commanding authorities in Iraq, written by Colonel Stuart Harrington, an expert on counterintelligence and interrogation, at the end of 2003, warned the military leadership that the task force, which had about 1,000 Special Forces soldiers working with CIA counterparts, were abusing prisoners in ways that could be construed as illegal. It was a platoon from this task force that kicked in Jamadi's door 3 months later. Air Force Reserve Colonel Steve Kleinman risked a 22-year career as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Air Force to try to stop it. Kleinman was thin and fit, with sharply chiseled features, green eyes, and a military haircut.
You're supposed to skip over that part.
Was I really?
No. That's called observation. When I'm in the military, and the writer observed, he has a military haircut. Who would have thought?
He had spent his whole career in the area of human intelligence. In 2003, he became the senior intelligence officer for survival training in the Department of Defense. The assignment brought him to the JPRA's headquarters at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington, from which SERE training was administered. Although he was surrounded by SER instructors, Kleinman was surprised to find that he was the only officer there with any real-life experience questioning foreign prisoners. While they were teaching in simulated conditions of capture and torture, he had served as a military interrogator in 2 previous campaigns, in Panama and the First Gulf War. He regarded survival training as noble. But when he was sent to Iraq in the fall of 2003 as part of the SERE delegation advising on interrogation, he said, "It was a life-changing event for me." Kleinman declined to provide details about whom he worked with in Iraq, some of which were classified. But other sources and documents make clear that he was sent to advise TF-20. The first stop was Camp Cropper, the military's central booking facility near Baghdad International Airport. So many Iraqi prisoners were being brought in that Kleinman asked where they would all be housed. When they told me Abu Ghraib, he said, I laughed. I couldn't believe it. The place was a symbol of Saddam's abuses. They should have turned it into a school or a hospital or just blown it up. Instead, he said, as soon as they stood it up, Abu Ghraib became the repository for our mistakes. Rejecting Rumsfeld's argument that the only problem was a handful of wayward soldiers, he said, it was not a few rotten apples. It was the Zimbardo experience writ large. Kleinman thought he had been brought to Iraq to identify problems in the task force interrogation program. The Special Forces commanders in Washington were dissatisfied and wanted better intelligence. After a cursory look, the problem seemed obvious to him. Quote, I couldn't believe the lack of professionalism. Interrogation is both an art and a science, and what they were doing was neither, he said. Many of the interrogators lacked training, and those who had attended the Army's course on interrogation in Fort, how do I pronounce that? Fort
Huachuca.
Thank you. I don't know that. Often years later had been taught the wrong methods for an insurgency. They were asking the wrong questions. They were trained on a Cold War model. Kleinman said, designed for combat in which one organized force faced another. So when they asked our insurgents for their chain of command, he said, many truthfully didn't know. Insurgencies have cellular structures without formal commands. But these guys didn't believe them, said Kleinman. They thought they needed more force. Instead of wanting his analysis, Kleinman soon learned the JPRE wanted him to share his SERE techniques. He said the attitude was, hey, we have a real live interrogator who also knows SERE, so show us. Kleinman refused. It was an unlawful order, he said, and an unlawful act. He reminded his commander that the SERE techniques were designed to recreate illegal abuse outlawed by the Geneva Conventions. He pointed out that the task force and all U.S. personnel in Iraq were obliged to treat captured insurgents within the bounds of the Geneva Conventions. But according to an internal military investigation, the JPRA commander, Randy Moulton, argued that the Geneva Conventions were moot. Quote, these people would never observe them if it was us, he argued. The investigative report by the Inspector General said that Moulton believed that the Iraqi insurgents were not enemy prisoners of war covered by the Geneva Conventions, but, quote, designated unlawful combatants against whom SERE techniques could be used. The report says further that the top commander in the U.S. Joint Forces overseeing special operations agreed and gave, quote, verbal approval to try to use the SERE techniques. For bucking these direct orders from the top rungs of the Pentagon to inflict illegal levels of cruelty on the prisoners, Kleinman said he soon found himself, quote, the least popular officer in the country. I got into serious arguments with many people. They wanted to do things. They were itching to. It was about revenge, not interrogation. And they thought I was coddling terrorists. He said, some of the special forces operations soon started getting up whenever he sat down near them in the mess hall. One ranger stood over him while sharpening a knife in his face and warned, it wouldn't be good for your health to sleep too soundly. Please welcome Steve Kleinman.
Let me say from the beginning, I wanted her to read that because it puts into context what I have to share with you today. Don't take it for a second that I wanted her to read that because I thought it celebrated anything I did, because it was a horrible chapter in American history that I happen to be like Forrest Gump, kind of on the margins of it. If I could wish it away, I would. But I can't, so what we can do is try to fix it. And I think fora like this is an opportunity for us to examine the practical challenges of life. And it's not about morality. We can dig deeper. It's all about conscience. So with that, I'll begin my formal remarks, but it can be very informal. First of all, if you look around this group, certainly the participants, and you played that game, you'll pick out the non-scholar. That wouldn't be a very difficult one because he's standing before you right now, which means I have the opportunity and even the challenge of taking a handful of data points and extrapolating to infinity. But the other thing, too, I learned, read your email. I mean, for months, when did we get our first invitations? A year ago? I kept thinking, let's see, conscience, what can we talk about? Consciousness? I started getting about consciousness. Can you imagine me get up and speak for 10 minutes about consciousness, and then finally Yusef says, it's conscience. And I used to be like Rosanna Dana about, never mind. But really, they are connected. To understand conscience, we need to be consciously aware of the process, and certainly that's what we've been doing these last 2 days. It requires a deep introspection, a deep examination of what conscience it is. And we've seen both the abstract, the historical, even talking about the cognitive neuroscience of conscience. And we're still, I don't think anybody in this room would walk away saying that we really understand it. But that awareness, it helps us understand what our options are, what the challenges are, and certainly what the shaping factors are. Let me portray myself in a slightly different light after that introduction. Anybody here, raise your hands, lie, cheats, and steals? Wait, at least we, whoa, hold on, let me check. Yep, my wallet's still here. Okay, fine, good. You might want to check your wallets as well. Okay, how many here get paid to do that? I've spent, there you go. We'll have to, I knew I liked you from the day I walked in here. We have that simpatico. I essentially have spent 28 years lied, cheating, and stealing, but I can say I've done so, at least allegedly, on behalf of my country. I've been paid to do that. I've been exceptionally well trained to do that. And if I may say, without false modesty, I'm actually quite good at it. I try to stay focused on the purpose behind lie, cheating, and stealing. When I say that, that's what human intelligence is all about. Not just being an interrogator where you're lying a lot, you're creating stories, but I was also a clandestine case officer, recruiting foreign assets and network. And that's all about getting people to lie and to cheat and to steal on your behalf. And when I say on your behalf, I mean on your behalf. Allegedly, again, it's in the national interest. So you can imagine that my entire career has been a personal laboratory to examine the challenge of conscience, because I think I was brought up with character. Certainly, I'm a second-generation military officer. I couldn't think more highly of my late father. He lived his life. You could tell his values by the way he lived, not just by the way he spoke. But yet, I'm from the beginning, I am presented with moral dilemmas, one after the other. Again, with the end state is supposed to explain it away, the promotion, the protection of American national interests or the interests of our allies. But yeah, also, I'm an aficionado. Even if I have any sort of scholarship associated with me, it would have to do with the art of war. Sun Tzu Bing Pa, the Master Wu's treatise on military strategy. And at the sum of that is all warfare, all conflict is based on deception. So, and then at the same time, he also says something which I think is very morally upstanding. That is, that the supreme ultimate is not to take all by fighting, but to take all under heaven without fighting. People don't have to die because you're clever. But again, the cleverness has a basis in deception. So again, a career in intelligence, it gives me that personal laboratory that allows me to make those extrapolations from a few data points. And certainly, throughout 28 years, I had a number of experiences and events that, for lack of a better way of describing, would make you go, What I want to share with you today is 5 essential themes, I think, that apply to conscience. We have scarcity, and I'll go into each one in some detail. Scarcity, inequity, opportunity, community, and unity. And since I love that sort of literary license I'm taking, I will try to introduce a little bit of levity and show some pity so I don't incur your enmity. How's that? Scarcity. I'm sure at some point in many of your lives, if you live long enough, you have either encountered for yourself or people that are close to you the idea that we don't live forever. In my military career, I've been to war 3 times. Once when we invaded Panama on just cause, went also to Desert Storm, the first one, and then, as Lucy explained, my deployment to Iraq in 2003. In each of those, I had those close call experiences where bullets hit very close to me, or in the first Gulf War, the Scud missiles that were being launched from around Baghdad were actually targeted exactly where I was on 2 occasions. That was a scary thought until later I realized how poor the guidance systems were. So actually the safest place you could ever be was at the aiming point where they were supposed to land. But it makes you, and then on top of that, my mother just celebrated her 90th birthday. My beautiful, spirited, loving mother. She's teeny and tiny and 90 years old, and I realize she's not going to live forever. Which reminds us, that leads in, the scarcity. To be consciously aware of the astonishing brevity of life. The opportunity to do good things that our conscience should be telling us to do is so brief. We better take advantage of those opportunities while we can, because we may not get another one. So we need to get busy. The second thing, inequity. It's those real-world inequities, those challenges to our conscience that are key to translating theory that we've talked about in the last few days into practice. Because without that friction, let me put it this way, a metaphor, that same friction and pressure that creates diamonds also can create gems of conscience, or they can create nothing but coal. So without the inequities, the examination, the real, true, practical, meaningful examination of conscience is really impossible. It can be a fascinating, abstract exploration that leaves us exactly where we began, at least from a real-world perspective. So that leads to opportunity. This is the spotlight, the opportunity to put your conscience, your moral values into play. That is like a spotlight that leaves bare and open to the world to see where your values, where your conscience actually is. Not what you talk about, not what we've written about, but how we actually live our lives. It is the real versus the theoretical. The Chinese have a lovely saying, I think, that applies here, and that is, I can't hear your words because your actions speak so loudly. I think that's important for us all to consider, to think about how we speak about moral issues and conscience specifically, but also how that manifests in how we live our lives. It's very, very easy to say what we would do, or what we would have done in a set of circumstances. But it's very, very difficult, the doing or the living with what perhaps we should have done. And I would have to say that statements of conscience without action are the beginning of delusion. We can't delude ourselves. So timeliness is critical. When you're presented with an opportunity to act upon your conscience, there's rarely, hey, can I get back to you on that moment? And you have a choice of either responding or reacting. And those are two very different things. Reacting is this visceral, in the moment, emotionally driven, I don't know what to do, and so I think this is the best. Or perhaps there's no consideration, no calculation of what's the best for anybody other than yourself. Or you can respond because you've thought these issues through. You've fought with them, with yourself, and with colleagues that you respect. At gatherings such as this, so we know where is my conscience on specific issues. And that leads into community. It's my experience that issues of conscience ultimately are very, very much a solo pursuit. And I find that the more difficult the circumstances become, the more solitary we not only feel, but often find ourselves to be. So communities are very valuable. They offer lessons, they offer legacies, and certainly literary interpretations of issues, of issues relating to conscience. So I would say, I would exhort each of us to be very, very, very careful about the communities that we select, because they will influence how we live our lives. What I was perhaps most shocked by from the very beginning when I started teaching interrogation, as well as seeing it in the real world, was what I regretfully call, because he's on the faculty right here at this fine institution, is I call the Zimbardo phenomenon or potential. And from my own experience, I like to think that I surround myself with principled people. And I've worked around people that I think on average would be considered principled individuals. But I found in teaching interrogation that a small percentage, and it varied, it was less than 10%, but it was more than 1%, who faced with the wrong circumstances would act out in ways that would not only astonish you, but would repulse you. I mean, even in exercise, we would go to South Korea and do very intensive exercises trying to replicate a wartime effort. And we would be interrogating South Koreans or Americans on alternating days. And I would have some of my students, people that I taught a very specific method for interrogation that was respectful of human rights, that was consistent with the Geneva Conventions, certainly consistent with US law. And they would suddenly be doing things that you saw in Abu Ghraib or that you saw in the Stanford prison experiment. And you have to wonder, where does this come from? I used to think it's a mystery of the mind, but having spent the last 2 days with you folks, I think it's a mystery of the conscience. Here's another mystery of the conscience, going back to Sun Tzu. Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you need not fear loss. I wonder if there is a Pew survey done the day before 9/11, what the average American would say about torture. I don't have the data to support it, but I strongly feel that the vast majority would say Americans, simply like this, Americans do not torture. That's beneath us. It's beneath our character. It's inconsistent with our historical record. Whether that's true or not, I think that's what they believe. I think the last survey was done about 2 years ago by the Pew survey, and over half of Americans still think under some circumstances torture is an appropriate response. Now this is interesting, and I don't mean this as a dagger into anybody's spiritual heart, but I find this interesting, is those people who describe themselves as attending religious services on a regular basis, their percentage of people who approve torture is even higher than those who say they don't. I don't know what the connection is, and perhaps I shouldn't have brought it up, but it's interesting about where our conscience comes from. Does it come from a religious tradition? Does it come from family traditions? Nathan Chapman, I believe, in yesterday's panel talked about overlapping moral communities, which I love the elegance of that. And I think that's a nice redundancy to have, almost like NASA, always having that right backup. But sometimes you'll find yourself without a single community. And that's where I found myself in August of 2003. I was surrounded by people who wore the same uniform I did. Again, second-generation military officer who I never would say that I drank the Kool-Aid that whatever American did, therefore made it right. I lost my virginity on that many, many years before. But still, we were trying to take down some people that were very violent. But when it came down to the challenge of conscience, how do we treat people in our custody? which I knew what Geneva Convention said, and I knew what my ethical standards as an interrogator, and I knew what my responsibility as a military officer was. I couldn't find a single person that supported me. What was my response? After a while, I began to think, well, maybe I'm missing something. Really, maybe, how is it that I could be surrounded by hundreds of people, as they described in the book? I would go into the mess hall, sit down, people would get up and move away like I was a leper. I was coddling the terrorists. Don't you know that these people, I love that when they say these people, as if they're somehow different. I had that same question twice when I was testifying for Senate committees, and they said, these people. I said, there's no these people, they're just people. If you need Martians to be interrogated, call somebody else, I don't know them, but people, I understand. So when you're looking for communities, I should have had 3. Okay, number 1, as a military officer, when I took my first oath and every time I got promoted, I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So the Constitution, the rule of law, that should be my moral community. But so did every other officer that I was serving with. Secondly, as an intelligence officer, specifically a human intelligence officer, in this case, more specifically still an interrogator, I knew what the ethical guidelines were set out by the law of armed conflict and specifically the Geneva Convention, Common Article 3, that talks about what you can and cannot do, how you need to treat people. Then I had my father. Sorry, I never get through this story. Give me a moment. He was still alive at that time. He died 3 days after I got back. But 15 years earlier, my grandmother was dying. It was a good death. She was 94, living on her own, and then just one day she got sicker, and we lost her. And so my dad and I were talking about the concept of death. He was a navigator in World War II, celestial navigation. Even as a child, he'd point out all the constellations. And our favorite was Orion the warrior. And I knew that one so easy to point out, whether it's a busy sky or it's there by itself. And he said, one day one of us is going to go, and the other one, forgive me. The other one needs guidance. Just look up there and you'll find it, because I'll be there. So I'm surrounded by officers who don't know the rule of law. I'm surrounded by officers who don't understand the ethics of what we should do. And 2 o'clock in the morning, I look into the Baghdad sky, and there's 2 things. The moon seemed closer than it ever had been, and just about 20 degrees north of that was Orion. So close I could reach out and touch it. And I remember thinking, okay, Dad, I got it. So I knew what the United States Air Force, at least I thought I knew what the United States Air Force expected of me. I thought I knew what my ethics as an interrogator expected of me, but I was damn sure what my father expected of me. And so shoulder to shoulder, we did what was right. It destroyed my career for a while. But you know what? In fact, I will share this with you. Afterwards, I was redeemed, and I was actually on my way to being a brigadier general. I should be standing before you as that today. 3 months ago, I got a call from a major general saying that won't happen. It should happen, but there are some other generals who didn't like you speaking like that. And I'll tell you what, I'd rather be the second Colonel Kleinman than any General Kleinman and sit before you and be able to share this with you. So, unity, the final point. And thank you for forbearance, and I apologize for the emotion. Unity, partisan conscience, that's almost like an oxymoron if you think about it. I mean, when the students came for this fall term here at Stanford University and they're signing up for physics, did they say, which do you want, Republican physics or Democrat physics? When they signed up for biology, was it, do you want the conservative version or the liberal version? There's only one physics, there's only one biology, and I would say, and I'm putting myself out on a limb, there's only one conscience. There's only one conscience that we need to work towards. Physicists, you know, they're pursuing the idea of the unified theory that puts all the forces that explain the universe into one single elegant equation, essentially, put it all together. They're still struggling with that, but I think we should pursue something similar, a unified field, if you will, or a unified theory of conscience, one that reflects the best part of us and that can be readily observed in both our words and deeds. So I'm going to conclude with the nice way that Nancy shared when she was quoting Bob Dylan. I'm more of a jazz fusion sort of guy, so I'm going to quote Tower of Power. And I think this tells, at least it's taught me everything I ever needed to know about conscience. I can't stand to see the slaughter, but still I eat the meat. I can't stand dishonest people, but still sometimes I cheat. I can't stand that air pollution, but still I drive a car. maybe that's the reasons why things are the way they are. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone who organized this conference, Nancy especially for reaching out with an invitation long ago, and for inviting me here. It's an honor. It's an honor to be on a panel with Yusef, and I don't think I need to emphasize enough what an honor it is to be on a panel with you, Steve, having written a book about people like you. At worst, journalists, writers, scholars who write about issues of conscience, at worst, we are voyeurs and sensationalizers. At best, we are sensitive analysts and maybe even occasionally moral witnesses. But we are not actors. We don't do the things that Steve just described having done. And I was acutely aware of that difference writing a book about people who did do those things and who stood very much alone for having done them. My book, this book, is a little different than probably most of the other books written by the various contributors to the panels here that you've heard before, in that it is organized, although it very much engages various disciplines from moral psychology to the law to history to literature. It is a book ultimately of stories, 4 stories, and it's structured around 4 stories for 2 reasons. One is that that's my skill set, telling stories, and I felt like this issue, conscience, and when to act on it and when not to act on it, I wanted people to read these stories. I wanted people to care, and I believed that through the stories, the dilemmas, the intellectual questions, get crystallized and illuminated in the most powerful way. The other reason I wrote stories rather than just a meta-analysis is that I think there is something ineffable and mysterious about every act of conscience, that no matter how much we want to generalize, each of these acts is in some ways unique, whether it is spontaneous or deliberative, altruistic or political, secular or religious, and admirable or not admirable. And I want to devote the next 5 minutes or so that I have to that last question, admirable or not admirable. To flesh it out, I will go to one of the stories in my book, the 3rd chapter, which is actually about a couple of stories. But the main character in that chapter is a soldier named Avner Wishnitzer, an Israeli soldier who grew up in a secular, quasi-socialist environment. He grew up on a kibbutz, deeply patriotic, deeply loyal to the idea that when he turned 18, he would contribute to his country by serving in the military. And he did serve in the military for 3.5 years in Sayeret Matkal, which is the Israeli equivalent of the Delta Force, the most elite unit you can get into. And he extended his service a couple of months out of dedication. Shortly after finishing his service, he went back to the kibbutz and started working there, and in exchange for that, they agreed to pay for his college education. So he started taking courses in history. He is now a PhD in history. But Avner was invited shortly after he came back to a slide session and a lecture by his sister, who was a documentary filmmaker. And at that lecture, he saw images of Palestinians living in a place called the South Hebron Hills, a place he'd never been to actually as a serviceman, but that he knew where it was. And the images showed water wells that had been poisoned, crops that had been destroyed, people being harassed by Jewish settlers under the watch of the army. And Avner was sitting in a chair just like you're sitting in right now. And he spent the entire time fidgeting in this chair, uncomfortably. He did not like being exposed to this. He did not quite believe it, but he also didn't disbelieve it enough to shut it out, to not decide he had to know more. Something pricked his conscience. And so he agreed very reluctantly to go on a convoy with some people who had decided they would go to this place to deliver blankets to the Palestinians living in this area. And to cut to the chase, he went on this convoy. At a certain point, the convoy was blocked by soldiers who told the people in the buses, you can't go here, this is a closed military zone. Avner, very much identified with the soldiers, thought everybody should turn around, you should not disobey the army in doing this. But there was again this dissonance in him. Wait a minute, what we have here is blankets, not dangerous goods. We're delivering them supposedly to farmers being harassed. He felt that same dissonance he felt in the chair. And eventually he went. And that experience was his first experience ever talking directly to Palestinians, not as a soldier, just as a person. He had learned Arabic, he knew Arabic, but he had never had such a conversation. That was the first act in several others that eventually caused a moral awakening and led Avner to tell his commander that he didn't want to serve in any mission that crossed into the occupied territories. And he did this at the height of the Second Intifada, a wave of violence that struck Israel and made such an act particularly difficult for someone of his stature, for someone who was regarded as the person who would lead the fight against those who were endangering his fellow citizens. And he became what is known in Israel as a refusenik. Now, fairly simple, secular example, if we pull back. Liberals, pacifists, anti-war activists, and critics of the Israeli military policies will all see Avner as a fairly uncomplicated hero in this story. But he is not the only type of refusenik in Israel today. And in the chapter in my book where I describe Avner's story, I go on to tell the story of another soldier, a soldier who lives in a settlement and who is recruited into the military and who decides not to go. He has this internal dissonance. And he won't go because he has been taught that the settlements are biblically ordained, that they are a part of his country, and he is afraid that he will be ordered by his commanders to do what soldiers did in Gaza, that is, to tell settlers to leave. So he, too, becomes a refusenik. And indeed, in Israel today, there are more refuseniks, conscientious objectors, if you will, on the right from the national religious camp than there are on the left from the secular pacifist peacenik camp. And for me, this sort of counter story created its own internal dissonance. How do I differentiate these two acts? On what basis? Well, for Avner, the first soldier, what got him to refuse, to say no, was that he no longer came to think of the policies in the occupied territories as a strategic error, as a bad policy. he came to think of those policies as a crime, and a crime in which he would be complicit if he went along. And he invoked in our conversation, just as he invoked in conversations with fellow soldiers of his, a very famous ruling that was made in a case by an Israeli judge in 1956. The case involved soldiers who fired on Arab villagers returning home after a curfew, and they had not been told about the curfew, and they were massacred. It was the largest massacre internally in Israeli history, the Kafr Qasim massacre. And the soldiers were put on trial. And what they said was that we were under orders. A convenient excuse that happened to be true. They were under orders. The judge in the case, Judge Halavi, ruled against this defense. He said not only that the soldiers could disobey this order, he ruled that they must disobey this order. And this particular order had to be disobeyed because in his ruling it was manifestly unlawful or manifestly illegal. It's translated both ways. And it had a black flag, a degel shachor, hanging over it. It was a crime. So it had to be refused. So Avner tells me, I came to see the policies in the occupied territories as a crime, a view I happen to share. What did the other soldier tell me? Let me just read you a very brief paragraph to get at the dilemma. The soldier's name is I describe him. I met a young admirer of Rabbi Kahana. Kahana was a far-right anti-Arab politician in Israel. I met a young admirer of Rabbi Kahana named Moshe Frumberg, wisp-thin and freckle-faced, with 6-inch side curls and a purple knitted skull cap on his head. Frumberg had recently been summoned to a draft center in Jerusalem to undergo an initial round of tests the army conducts for recruits. Before leaving, he and 2 friends hung a sign at the entrance that declared, "We won't be drafted to evacuate Jews!" Frumberg lived in Havat Gilad, a settlement outpost populated by so-called hilltop youth, who are known for their militant views. He'd recently passed his matriculation exams, he told me at the pizzeria in Jerusalem where we met, and in one course had learned that certain orders were inherently illegal, like shooting your friends, that's in quotes. These orders had a degel shachor, a black flag, over them, he told me. Quote, "From my point of view, evacuating Jews is also such an order," he said, smiling earnestly and sinking his teeth into the pizza. So, he invokes the same logic, a black flag, a manifestly illegal order. How do we distinguish these two cases? We can't distinguish between them on the grounds of sincerity or depth of conviction, or even, you might argue, seriousness. That doesn't work. Moshe Frumberg has just as deeply held, fierce convictions about these matters as Avner Wischnitzer has. We can't distinguish between them on the grounds of drawing on the shared moral precepts of your fellow citizens. Or maybe we can, but I'm not sure that would make Avner's refusal more acceptable to Israelis today than Moshe Frumberg's. Avner refused on the grounds of secular, humanistic, pacifist ideals. But those ideals are very much in the minority today in Israel, certainly taking those ideals and saying, I will refuse to serve. Frumberg invoked the ideals of the national religious parties in Israel, which are on the rise and increasingly popular and increasingly accepted. So we can't do a popularity test either. How do we distinguish them? I'm going to just close by offering two grounds that I conclude with, but I really hope that other people can enrich and push this further, because having written the book, I'm still not satisfied my grounds are sufficiently robust. The first distinction I draw is to do, in a sense, an empathy test. Most, in fact, all of the stories in my book are about individuals who exercise what Adam Smith called the moral imagination. They envision themselves in the shoes of a person suffering, and they decide they cannot do what they're being asked to do. And I think they engage in, above all, acts of imaginative resistance. Now, Avner Wischnitzer very clearly exercises his moral imagination, and he does it in a transgressive way, a way that makes him very unpopular. I think Steve just described his own unpopularity, and I think we can easily see why some kind of imaginative placing oneself in the shoes of the other took place. What about Moshe Frumberg? There is no place in his story for stretching the moral imagination. He has a set of precepts. They're very sincere. They're very deep. But they exclude from the circle of humanity one group, the Palestinians. I asked him, well, can your vision include some form of empathy for those who are not Jewish, who live in these places? And he said very simply, no, they have other places to live. The second, for lack of a better word, test or difference is the content test. How do we judge acts of conscience? Maybe we just have to judge them in the same way we judge acts of courage. That is, depending on their content. Susan Sontag got into huge trouble after 9/11 by saying that the people who flew planes into the World Trade Center were not cowards, and I think she was right. There is immoral courage. There is courage that is exercised for horrific or hateful purposes, and I think conscience can be exercised for destructive and horrific purposes, just as it can be exercised for noble, tolerant, empathic purposes. That's the best I can do to distinguish these two cases. I look forward to your questions and a discussion.
It's a great privilege to be here, to be in this conversation. Torsion. He was in waist-high grass, an echo of a voice searched for him as he crawled along a ditch. The greenhorn's blood reddening the mud, and the scent of burnt cosmoline. What's the spirit of the bayonet soldier? His mind, the mouth of a cave with the horizon nitrate. He walked on his hands, rain, tapping his helmet. He had been tapered, honed, and polished an AIT, and then pointed towards grid coordinates on a ragged map, his feelings cauterized, and now a hint of wet light touches the sniper's rifle and a grove of jackfruit. Silence, a stone in his belly, an anvil on his head. What's the spirit of the bayonet soldier? He dove on the pig, and his body became part of the metal. Tracer rounds scorched the living air. The dirt and sky and the edges of night approach. Only his fingers could recall threading another belt of ammo. He didn't wish to know how many shadows hugged the ground. No, he couldn't stop firing as he rode the M60 machine gun to a primal grunt before he buckled and spewed vomit over the barrel, the torsion, a whiplash of hues. What's the spirit of the bayonet soldier? After medevac coppers flew out the badly wounded and the body bags, 3 men in his squad became 2 tigers at sunset and walked through the village. They kicked a pagoda till it turned into the dust of cinnabar, and then torched thatched roofs. The captain's citation never said how fear tussled him in the paddy ditch, and the star in its velvet-lined box was a scarab in a pharaoh's brain. The dead visit nightly. The company chaplain blessed him, but he'd sit hours gazing out at the sea and could never bless himself. The battalion saluted, but he wished to forget his hands, and the thought of metal made him stand up straight. He shipped back to the world only to remember blood on the grass, men dancing on a lit string of bullets, women and children wailing among the flame trees, and he wished he hadn't been trained so damn well. What's the spirit of the bayonet soldier? He was back now, back to when he banished fawns as swords to guard their treehouse, his mama at church singing hallelujah, his daddy and Lucky's swigging Falstaff. He kept thinking of his cousin Eddie, who drove his girl to Galveston and a Chevy pickup in California dreaming, looped through the cab. He could still see round fishing boats on the edge of the South China Sea, a woman's long black hair falling in a rising wave, moonlight on the skin of samples, their bodies wound in concertina. The back porch swing going higher and higher till his hiking boots almost touched the ceiling. He switched off his blue transistor radio and walked back into pines among the black warrior, searching for arrowheads, bagging rabbit and quail. He's back to the Friday his draft card came, when he first mastered a willful blindness, back to outsmarting prey, and he duck waltzed across the clearing under power lines, now ashamed of something naked as a good question, redbirds, flash, and a counter ambush. Thou shalt not kill echoes across clay hills miles from his loved ones, and he slouches deeper into the Choctaw's old growth towards a hoop of light, away from a face stealing his brother's, so deep he can hardly hear himself plea to shiny crows in a weeping willow. One aftermath of war. In May 1980, 5 years after the war ended, I went into the wooded hills outside Chico, California, with Tom, a former Navy corpsman in Vietnam, who now had a true mission. He was talking vets out of the hills, back into civil society. There were vets who opt for being alone in the woods with their memories and thoughts. And I wonder why they had gone this direction, condemned to their own world after returning to the world. While this self-exile, I didn't see anyone, but Tom swore someone was there. Soon I knew he was saying, I knew what he was saying, because I could also feel the person I couldn't see, a presence of otherness. I'd also heard of vets living in the forests of the Northwest and the Deep South who didn't trust themselves back in the real world, who had found refuge among the birds and animals who lived off the land by hunting and fishing. And I wondered why they felt more at home in their self-imposed exile. What could drive them away from their loved ones into isolation? Was it what they had witnessed? Was it what they had done as they followed orders? What knowledge within them, what conscience was holding them accountable in the woods? I think their consciousness was working on them overtime, perhaps because of the culture of contradiction. On Sunday, one is taught, "Thou shalt not kill." And on Monday, he hears a drill sergeant shout, "What's the spirit of the bayonet, soldier?" And he responds, "To kill, sir." Perhaps there's a conscientious objection after one has been fully initiated through the physical and psychological aspects of war. Perhaps all war stories made of blood and guts, consciously or subconsciously, are anti-war stories. Maybe this is because one often experiences a conscientious objection after the fact, in the aftermath of war. Perhaps this is what the poem attempts to address. I should say that I had also prepared another poem to read, and it had to do with individuals who threw themselves on grenades in Vietnam. 14 or 15 young black men who threw themselves on grenades. And I sort of wrestled with it. And it had to do with the fact that I believe that was all connected to that double bind of "thou shalt not kill," and at the same time having a certain kind of allegiance to what they had been taught, what had really been inbred in them. So consciousness or conscience is a willful act. I don't think we are born with it. I think it comes out of culture and maybe even out of a social osmosis. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Wow, really amazing from all three of you. So before I say something, maybe to ask you a question and then open up to the audience, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to say to each other, having listened to each other.
That was awesome. That's all I'll say. Wow.
I have a poet's heart because I can feel touched by it. I just don't have the poet's talent to put it in words like you do, so thank you.
You know, in my psyche, I have been having this discussion for a long time. One reason because we internalize what we experience. And these shared stories, shared ideas, principles, is a necessary dialogue.
Can I add one more thing, too?
Yeah.
Just for Eyal, don't ever diminish the value of your role in capturing these stories, because if you didn't, they would be isolated, the value would be limited, but you step outside your comfort zone to go and capture this in a way that becomes a legacy for many. So never, ever, at least not when I'm in earshot, ever diminish your role in doing these things. It's so valuable.
Coming from you, I'll accept that.
All right, well, let me, I wanted to ask all three of you to reflect on where Eyal left off, which was, what are the limits of the state's duty in some way to accommodate conscience? Are there times when we want to differentiate, and in fact, we don't want to accommodate conscience? And I apologize, I wasn't here for the whole discussion over the last 2 days. Maybe this is a topic that has come up again and again, but it seems to me to be a very important question about the limits, because clearly there are acts of conscience that no decent society can accommodate. John Rawls gives the example, if I remember this, of groups that believe in human sacrifice conscientiously, that we can't accommodate the refusal of people to live by our laws, which refrain from allowing people to sacrifice. But clearly there are lots of cases that are not as easy or simple as that one. And so I wanted to ask the three of you to reflect on it. And I'm a little worried by the two props that you threw out. I think they're suggestive, but I worry about them. So one was empathy. And there's something, of course, to imaginative empathy, but we have to know who and where and what we're empathizing with, and that varies a lot. And so I'm just worried about how you would evaluate that. And I think content pushes us maybe in a better direction, but even there, I'd like to know more about how we think about the contents that we ought to refrain from accommodating.
Can I just say one thing that is also, again, another way of putting what I was trying to say, that is actually said by an Israeli general I interviewed, who's in the book, who has the position that most generals, I think, in Israel have, which is, I described these two cases to him, and he said, you see, that's why no refusal can be tolerated, because if one form is tolerated, there will be other forms tolerated, and then we will have anarchy. We won't have an army. And so I said to him, I'm not satisfied with that position, and I actually don't even think he's fully satisfied with that position, and I'll tell you why. I said to him, okay, so what you're saying is you would like every soldier to put his or her politics aside before they go into a unit. Is that correct? And he said, yes. And I said, what about their morality? And he said, their morality they have to take with them. And I said, okay, politics and morality, is there a clear line between those two things? And he couldn't answer, because most people who think about that long enough know that it's not a clear line. And he was honest enough to acknowledge that. It's why this ruling was issued, that there are certain orders you must disobey. So I don't know where to go further except to say that the position of no act of refusal can be tolerated is, I think, insincerely held even by those who sometimes say it. They're not fully satisfied with it either.
Could I open it?
You may know this, but if not, you may be interested to know that when there was a draft in the United States, there was provision for conscientious objection, but only conscientious objection based on a rejection of any and all wars, not so-called selective conscientious objection. And it seems to me that the two stories you told were of individuals who would not qualify for conscientious objection under the standards that operated in the United States because this was selective conscientious objection. So it's interesting, just for comparative purposes, to observe that this country had a policy in place that would not have accommodated either of the people that you write about.
Or you, right? Because if it's a very specific order that you had a problem with. But those are the hard cases, no?
In this case, though, it's not really conscientious objection. It is obeying the law, right? Obeying the military law. So I wouldn't, that's always acceptable. So if you're saying that I am acting in accord with the rules, the rest of you aren't, that's a different profile. You may be wrong about that, but you're saying that I am trying to act in accord with the military requirements, which is different from saying that I conscientiously object to participating in this regime.
I see your point, and on reflection, I look back at my own experience, and I have evolved as a human being, certainly even as a military officer in the role of the military in a democracy. And again, I talked to about my father. He was part of the greatest generation in World War II. The insidious shadow of fascism threatened not only the entire Europe but possibly the entire world. They were trying to put together an operational relationship and alliance with Mexico. But, with all due respect, especially to those who've died in fighting the war since then, including my three, if I had to try to defend those to people like this group, sharp, understanding history, politics, I would find myself hard-pressed. And so, if you think about what you're saying, you're absolutely right about the law, but you kind of wonder, maybe that's not the best way to say, okay, you have to be against all wars, or you have to be in this one. And I think maybe a country is better served if the people that are going to go and perhaps pay the price are one to say, not this one, like hell. Okay, this next one that's existential, I'm on board. Send me. But some of the ones that we've been in, it's kind of questionable. So that's a very interesting point you're making.
I certainly wasn't commenting pro or con on that.
Right.
But what your Israeli officer said, then we'd have no army, is presumably the sensibility or attitude that animates the rejection of selective conscientious objection in the United States.
Yeah, and I think Rawls and other people have actually said that that's where the state and a military institution is most threatened. Of course, I mean it's easy enough to weed out the few pacifists. But the judgment that this particular set of orders or this particular order to fight this war is wrong, I don't know that any state or military would ever say we will accommodate that.
It's interesting about the military laws as such, because one has to declare oneself as a conscientious objector before he has been initiated into the machinery. And usually it has to do with religious rights as such. And after one has entered the military to, say for instance, disobey an order, one can be easily court-martialed. So I think an apparatus has to happen outside of the military. Certain laws have to be struck and initiated, perhaps in Congress, or other individuals who really care about what conscience really is about. So it's a difficult one. And I don't know, it's almost as if we ask a single individual to stand up against an institution. Is rather preposterous if we think about it, for that individual to be singled out.
That's a good point.
David?
Yes, I'm wondering if you know about the case of Aaron Watada. He was the first commissioned officer to refuse deployment to Iraq, and he was a career military person. He was a Boy Scout, super American, Asian American, and ironically, his decision not to go to Iraq was because he followed his commanding officer's instruction to learn something about Iraq. So he went to the county library and started reading up on this and learning about the war, and he decided that the war was illegal. And the Army prosecuted him for 3 years unsuccessfully and finally dropped the case because he was arguing that to deploy to Iraq would inevitably involve him in committing a war crime. So that's a very interesting case. I'm just wondering if you knew about that, but it's...
Yeah, I remember him. One brave soul, right? That's what it amounts to, yes.
Yeah, and the issue of race kicked
Right.
in immediately. I mean, what is this Jap, doing, betraying his country? And so there's a very interesting film that's being made about this that documents the flack he got for that. But anyway.
It's interesting to bring race into the equation because for African Americans, the military was a way of attempting to become a complete citizen. So African Americans always push to become part of that machine, and very few stood outside of that. We could point to one interesting moment happened in the Spanish-American War. David Phelan is his name. Yes. He actually stands up to that machine, and there's a Major Ferguson, I think it is, who sets out to really bring his head back in a sack, and that's what happens.
Yeah, I have a story that deals with race and conscience, but sort of a different way that I just really learned probably in the last 10 years. My sister's been married for 40 years to a gentleman, African American. So I got to know her father-in-law. And he's typical, again, greatest generation guy, very quiet. You don't know. And I heard that he had served in World War II. And so we chatted one evening. Not only served in World War II, he was an Army soldier who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And if you're not aware of that horrific, bloody experience, you should look it up on Wikipedia. But anybody who went through that was horrible. But I was so struck by his circumstance because he didn't come back to America and welcome home. He came back to the same America that he left. He was a full-fledged soldier out there in Europe, but he was only half a citizen when he came home. And talk about his conscience, I don't think anybody here would have questioned if he said, why am I going to put my life on the line for a country that doesn't recognize the fullness of my life? But he believed in the concept of America and perhaps the potential of the future this is way before the civil rights movement began. And he was one of thousands and thousands. But that type of, in my view, there's service and then there's service. There's a lot of service. There's some rewards at the other end of some sort. And his was just, I don't think he ever really realized it, but he set the stage for perhaps some white Americans at that time came home with a whole new respect for people that they had looked on with disdain. So that wasn't why he did it. It was just his country needed him and he went, even though this country wasn't there for him. That's impressive.
Okay, I've got a queue of 3 people. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. Eyal, we kind of talked about this yesterday, and not to diminish anything at all, and these are obviously things of of a two-sided coin. But what's in a sense what happens repeatedly in our culture, which is a soldier's culture, and thankfully it's not a victim's culture to be, is that what I call the Oliver Stone syndrome, is that we end up, what's missing here is a Palestinian, an Iraqi, and a Vietnamese. And this notion repeats itself. And no matter, while I do understand that there are 2 sides of the story and both deserve telling, we would be treated to an entirely different delivery, if you will, if a Palestinian was telling the same story and an Iraqi and a Vietnamese. Of course, Yusef would use perhaps even a little more complicated with the whole race issue in America and the soldiers. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I couldn't agree with you more. If you're, this isn't a complete account. To tell the story of an Israeli soldier grappling with whether or not to serve in the occupied territories is not to tell the story of a Palestinian living under military occupation. Those are not the same thing. I would just make it very clear and be blunt that that's not what my book does.
I have I'm not sure if this is relevant to your question. I think it is, though, or your observation. Again, during 2003 when I was there, it was incumbent upon me to protect literally the human rights of those prisoners. Now, having said that, I also interrogated a number of them, and there's that story about the ranger who threatened me, which I found that kind of unnerving, and I I was smart though. He gave me good advice: don't sleep too soundly, and I didn't. But then flip it over. I would go and interrogate in the method I use, which is relationship building. I mean, I could look at the hundreds of people I've interrogated. If they walked in this room right now, the worst they'd say is, "Oh, you got me on that one." It wasn't anything I ever did physically, emotionally, or psychologically. And conversely, at least three of them, they told me straight out, if I had a knife, I'd reach across the table and cut your throat right now. Because they hated me and what I represented so much. And so I said, well, wait a second, I've been protecting you. No, I didn't get into that debate. So it's kind of interesting, the whole stories of all the different stories, and it's not two, it's probably 57 or maybe more. Then you take the 11 parallel universes that are allegedly out there, and we have too many of them. But yeah, it'd be interesting to hear all the different sides. That's what my question the other day about when the emphasis on the story of Abraham. And remember, my question was, well, what about the story from Abraham's son? That's a whole different. Wow, Dad, nice.
Well, the whole thing about dialogue is so important. And that's how I see it, as a number of dialogues happening together, and that not that one comes to any kind of conclusion, but the fact that individuals are discussing things from their own points of view is necessary, of course, but just how those dialogues are in concert with each other is important.
So I've got Lucy, and then the woman back there, and then Jack, and then Nancy.
First of all, just thank you all three so much. And I wanted to apologize to Yusef, actually, because I barely made it through your introduction. My nerves got the better of me, and I'm sorry for kind of botching that. But I wanted to get back to what you were saying, actually, about conscientious objection and the actual legal process of, the actual certificate that you have to fill out, the forms and stuff. And the fact that sort of official conscientious objection has to happen prior to military experience. It was interesting when I was sending out notices to the community, the surrounding community about this event. I sent one to the local Quaker community, and I got back a very interesting response, which was that, well, some of the members of our community might be very interested in this issue of conscience, but there are no conscientious objectors on this panel. And I wanted to ask you both in particular, would you, Yusef mentioned the importance of a physical experience, to a physical material experience to radically alter you and change your conscience, or to do something to you. To go through the military experience. And for you also, you speak about an evolution, that your views on what you were and were not able to do, what human beings were and were not able to do, were powerfully altered by first going through that. And I guess I'm interested in this question of how we object from outside an experience. I think this is a problem that we've been encountering in different ways throughout these 2 days of how do we, in some ways it feels like you don't earn permission to object to something, or to raise a political problem, or to protest something without being in that situation. And on the other hand, everyone can't go through a war firsthand.
I don't believe that one has to go through a war in order to object. Matter of fact, it's necessary that we have those voices that haven't been fully initiated in the processes of war and experiences as such. I think it has a lot to do with the overall culture. I grew up where I felt like I had already been fully initiated in war, proxy war, from the time that I was 10 years old, so I think that has to be addressed. And perhaps what happens is that in warfare, one dehumanizes one's enemy in order to kill them. And I think that kind of dehumanization happens within the larger culture long before we face the so-called enemy. So that has to be dealt with, those contradictions. And also, I do believe at the moment there's necessary for a draft. Does that make sense? What I'm saying is that essentially what we have is a mercenary military. And conscientious objectors in a mercenary setting, does that exist? I don't think so.
I should have said this from the beginning. I'm here as a private citizen. My comments are not at all reviewed or approved by any part of the Department of Defense, okay? Any NSA's listening, got it? Chew some celery so they can't understand it. I think Yusef is so correct. If you look at the recruiting campaigns, it's all about money for college and learning a career that you can go off and do other things. Oh, by the way, in the interim, we're going to ask you to kill people and maybe die. But they just kind of, that's the fine print at the bottom. And the point, too, about about the draft. I mean, I think it's been very clear that members of Congress are so poorly represented in any of these wars in terms of their family members. Maybe if they really thought that some of their sons and daughters ran the risk of being at risk, they might think through these geopolitical challenges in a more enlightened fashion, to put it that way. So, yeah, the mercenary part, you kind of ask yourself, why not, if we want to fight wars? But the other thing, too, another comment, Lucy, was about the conscientious objector. Why can't this gentleman's story and the fact that he captures many stories be just as compelling, and certainly more lucid, but just as compelling, just as meaningful, and just as persuasive as somebody who's been there? I mean, it just that's the way it is. And what Yusef was saying was about this acculturation from the beginning. I can remember at officer training school, if you had to have your floors polished, and if somebody came in and walked in, we'd say, "Oh man, you're nuking my floor." We just completely what we're saying is, you launched a thermonuclear device on my floor, a weapon that can cause the type of, or inflicting kinetic energy related deaths, the type of which we cannot begin to get our heads or hearts around. But we just immediately, you go to a bar, it's a target-rich environment. You just disengage, you dehumanize, and as an interrogator, I mentioned earlier, you hear that all the time. These people are different, meaning jihadists. So they don't respond to typical or traditional interrogation. I'm hitting a big target here like that. It's but conscientious objectors, they don't have to go that far to realize they're being a sentient, intuitive human being and understanding when there's just war and when there's not. I think is just as valid.
I'll just add that that's 3 for 3. I also think we should have a draft. I think that one of the real moral calamities of this age right now is that the angst and trauma and the burden, in a sense, of living with Iraq and Afghanistan is so separated from the rest of the culture, and it's within one subculture. And I say that as the grandson and son of a soldier. And had my family stayed in Israel, I would have been a soldier as well. So in part, I'm looking at all these issues through that familial lens, that history, and that very palpable sense I always had that I could have been the soldier I'm writing about very easily. What would I have done? In terms of your question about conscientious objectors, I do think there's something uniquely, I don't mean to disparage or belittle an act of refusal that comes before someone has even gone there, but I think there's something unique and uniquely powerful about someone stepping in, about an insider drawing a limit. That's what my book is about. It's not about conscientious objectors. It's actually about people like Steve, people who are on the inside and actually are idealists. They believe very much in the principles of the organizations or the military or non-military that they've enlisted in. They believe in those principles to such a degree that when they see them being tarnished, they draw the line.
Over back there.
Want to start with a personal note?
Or she can just come here.
So I want to start with a personal note. I'm a student here in the Department of Comparative Literature, writing about law and literature and how they address atrocities. And I really want to thank all of you, and Nancy in particular, for organizing what I see as a private conference for my research. So it's been wonderful 2 days with amazing presentations. And this final panel, I think, really ties everything together. And I want to go back, Eyal, to what you actually concluded with, these two views that are indistinguishable, maybe. I grew up in Israel. I lived most of my life in Israel, and I know for certain what is my opinion. I'm not sure that I can distinguish between these two on philosophical grounds or, I don't know, theological grounds. They both are very convincing in their ways. what I would like to suggest maybe, and I think it ties back to what we talked about yesterday, and really just from the beginning, is that conscience is something very individual at the end. And you cannot really judge if it's right or wrong. The only test that you can present is the test of the community. And at one point, maybe, as you said, Avner's conscience will be more accepted. I don't think that's the case now in Israel, I agree with you. Other times, the settlers' conscience will be accepted or more accepted. So maybe we shouldn't be looking for ways, or I mean, I'm sure many philosophers will suggest smart ways to do that, but I'm not sure that there is really a practical way to distinguish between one conscience to the other. It is an individual choice that must be respected in the sense that accepting that each of us has his own beliefs or moral foundations. It's just a question of the community, and the only thing we can do in the political game, and in here I really relate to Arendt, is just to try and decide as a community, as a political body, what we agree to accept as part of the game and what not, and it changes all the time. And for that reason, it's also worth fighting for all the time. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. That very eloquently put. I guess what I would say, though, is that in some sense, this dilemma and the 2 stories I described, building a little bit on what was said, is a limited optic for this. I agree with you, it should be fought out in the community. It has to be. But there's another way to look at these 2 stories, which is actually the way most of the world looks at them right now. Most of the world, I can't think of a single country that acknowledges the legitimacy of the settlements and the political project behind it. There is no such country. Even the ones that okay it on the side, in principle say we don't approve of it. Whereas, so if Avner's position may lose within Israel right now, he's certainly winning at the global level. And so that's another way to look at this and to say, to critique the limits of this book. Well, it's telling 2 stories of 2 individuals, but in the broader scheme, there is an illegal policy here that is being supported, and it needs to be stopped.
I just want to add one thing about, it may be that this idea of conscientious refusal in the military is just a subcategory of a very, a much more prevalent issue that we have to face. So you can think about pharmacists saying they don't want to dispense contraceptives to doctors not wanting to perform abortions. Every society has to deal with the fact that people of conscience will disagree with some of the laws and decide what the limits are. And I don't think that the way to decide the limits is just to decide on the basis of which are the views you agree with. So you have to then think that there's got to be some boundary that's bigger than just the principles I agree with, but that isn't simply open to everything, because otherwise you get the person who, believes in genocide, and no state can accommodate that. No legitimate state can accommodate that. But anyway, but I think it's a really hard set of issues. Jack.
Stephen, I want to ask you a little bit, to speculate maybe just a bit about the sources, the attitudes that you encountered during your service. And I have 2 examples in mind. I think it's in a different article than the one that introduced you by Jane Mayer, but she had interesting discussion some years ago of the kind of growing acceptance of the ticking bomb scenario within the American Officer Corps. My sense would be, from the very limited military training I had a long time ago in my youth, that the American Armed Forces is actually fairly efficient about training people in terms of the basics. But the point of Mayer's article was that she thought, I think her supposition was, there had been a significant shift in attitudes taking place among, I think particularly among younger officers, and she traced a lot of it actually to the impact of 24. The television program and the way in which that had made a fictive device had made legitimate a moral position that was not itself grounded either in our public policy or, I assume, in the instruction. So that raises a kind of interesting question, because in a pure sense you could say this is an act of, I hesitate to say this is an act of conscience on the part of younger officers, but it does show some ability to reason independently on the basis of what appears to be a powerful, if rather problematic moral example. Second question comes to mind, I think also comes out of your passing reference to the Pew survey, and to speculate a bit about, do you think there are significant differences? I mean, if I understood your point correctly, on the part of officers or trained personnel who are more or less religious. One way in which Americans have started reflecting on what makes the military subculture distinct is not only that a small segment of the population is bearing, exceptional sacrifices, because of our policies and the rotation system in which it leads, but it's also that, I mean, there's some evidence that the officer corps in particular is much more religious than the general society. And I think actually the Air Force, I think by reputation, the Air Force Academy stands out as the institution where this is probably the most serious case. I don't have a hypothesis here about this, but I do want, since you mentioned the Pew thing in passing, I do wonder about its significance.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, as I introduced myself, I don't have to worry about having sufficient data to come to any conclusion. I'll just blurt it out. There is a very strong fundamental Christian culture in the United States military, especially among the officer corps. I can speak specifically from my service at U.S. Central Command, which, if you don't know what that does, that's the combatant command that's responsible for all that goes on for the U.S. From a national security perspective in the Middle East, including both wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I went there, I was signed there in October of 2008, leading up to the presidential election before last. And okay, I'm at that time maybe 2 years into being a colonel, so I show up. Other colonels, equivalent or civilian equivalents, I immediately got in a debate. I thought it was just kind of hazing the new guy, but there was a concept. Number one, we're fighting a false religion. I mean, this crusade mentality, and I kid you not, that those terms are used. And secondly, we can't have Barack Obama elected president because he's part of I'm not making this up, a Islamic sleeper cell. And these are not, quote, as flaky as the comment is, these aren't flakes. These are senior intelligence officers with 25 plus years still serving, to say I was a little bit rocked by it. So, yeah, I mean, there's a feeling of destiny, of divine inspiration. Retired Lieutenant General Boykin, who was one of the senior intelligence officers for all the military at the Pentagon, he was on tape at his church talking about my God is stronger than their God. This is right after 9/11, and there's a heavy theme of that goes on. And going back, I'm not sure I exactly understand the comment about the ticking time bomb in 24, but I do have some direct experiences. There was a brigadier general, an Army brigadier general, who was ordered to go out to Hollywood to talk to the producers of that. Everybody know we're talking about the TV show 24. I'm very glad to say that I got rid of my TV over 10 years ago. I've never actually seen an episode, but I know what it's all about. Essentially, every episode, torture saves a day, and it shows that, yeah, it's not a pretty thing, but it's a patriotic thing. And so a general had to go out there and ask them to tone it down because literally it was shaping the behaviors. Some of the things that they saw, that these young soldiers saw on TV, they were employing out in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the producer said, hey, we're not interrogators. We don't know what we're talking about. We're script writers. We're making this stuff up. If you guys can't control your soldiers, it's not our fault. But that bothered me, but not nearly as much as when I testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Senate Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and one other that escaped me. I could close my eyes, and I knew exactly by the question which side of the aisle it was coming from. And unfortunately, they would try to go toe-to-toe with me on interrogation policy. And here's a guy who's not only been an interrogator and a teacher of interrogator, who's been involved with research and written extensively about it. I understand the science of it deeply, and I know how it's operationally applied. But that was my basis. Their basis was having seen 24, for God's sakes. And if we wouldn't get in an argument about signals intelligence, how you capture the electromagnetic spectrum and you get communications, that's physics and mathematics. Same thing with imagery. They wouldn't get into that argument because it's beyond them. But they've read a book, They've read a novel, they've seen a TV show, they've seen a movie. That's the way interrogation is. And I say, well, if that's what you believe, if somebody that you love has an appendix burst, why don't you have Alan Alda? I saw him doing all sorts of operations, just kind of had that shoulder movement, and you get the snappy repartee to go with it. They didn't think that was as funny as you folks did, but they didn't have a sense of humor. So it's, in fact, my first engagement on this whole issue, I was driving along, I was at the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. I just came back from Iraq, and NPR was having a debate, two people, about the ticking time bomb scenario, which is a statistically improbable event that's actually never occurred, but it's captured our attention, and it's been a center of debate. I actually got through when I told them my background. There was a stipulation between both sides, those against it and the ones who were for it, that, well, it actually works, that waterboarding or torture. It's just whether we should use it or not. I said, wait a second. Waterboarding is effective. It'll make anybody talk, but it won't control what they talk about. With waterboarding, I promise, with long enough, probably wouldn't take that long, I would absolutely admit that I was in my third trimester of my pregnancy. If that's what it took to make it stop. And that's just it. First of all, you don't know, do they know what we're talking about? Then you think about the fragility of memory. Who here can tell me about a meeting that took place three days ago? If I asked you more than 6 questions, you'd start getting it wrong. And I can imagine being sleep deprived, being threatened, being waterboarded, all these other horrible things. Your memory slips away. So all these sort of, the physically, emotionally, psychologically abusive, coercive, forceful approaches, it's like interrogation is like holding wet soap in your hand. If you squeeze it, it's going to pop out. You need to hold it gently. You need to elicit, not coerce. But that still drives, because it's like the cavalry. Torture is like cavalry. I say torture is the biological chemical warfare of intelligence. People say, well, there was a gentleman who just lost his congressional race that I don't regret at all, Lieutenant Colonel West down in Florida. He's famous because he discharged his weapon in a mock execution. Well, what's wrong? He wasn't hurt. Yes, but again, perspective. If you ask that Iraqi, do you think he knew it was a mock execution? He thought it was an execution until the time he finally walked away. But yet he would say, I would do anything to save my men. Well, that whole story is putting your men at great risk. I mean, they're not thinking strategically. It's just, you can tell I haven't really thought about these issues at all. It just is all extemporaneous, but, and I have no emotional involvement either.
Nancy and then Colin.
First of all, thank all, the three of you for a tremendously moving panel. And I'm glad that it's the last panel in a way, because it's had this kind of impact, just kind of a visceral impact. And I think that's a good way to end a conference. I didn't intend it to be that way. But over the last 2 days, we've been talking about conscience literally from 9 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night with an hour-and-a-half break. And I don't know if I speak for everybody else or even anybody else in the room when I say that I'm more confused than possibly I was before it started. I mean, it's just blossomed. The concept has blossomed and blossomed. So I want to begin just a kind of chain of thought, sort of between the three papers, beginning, Eyal, with your statement that, and really for all of you, that basically what you've got with conscience is a mystery. You use the word mystery. And then I would go to what Steve had to say with his 5 categories, the fourth being community. And you said, you better be careful about what kind of community you select for yourself. But in your case, you were a community of one. And a community of 2, I and myself? No?
No, the guy up on Orion.
Yes. But here on the earth, you were a community of one.
Well, now we're putting stipulations on it. I mean, I have to live in this world.
I figure when you described your plight as being like a leper, that's really a community of one. And then you said, The fifth point, if I understood you right, was, you talked about the possibility of a unity of conscience. I don't know if that's just kind of an ideal, that somehow we could all understand conscience in the same way, and this would be the only thing that would make it viable in the world, is if we all understood it the same way. But then I returned to Eyal and what I'll just call the Avram and Moshe syndrome. And then we know that the duality is just the beginning of it, that in fact, it's infinite. The number of consciences and the degrees to which they're antithetical make me very pessimistic that we'll ever have anything like a unity of conscience. And so I go to Yusef, who spoke about two things that are very mysterious, but that I feel have directly to do with conscience. And one was the phrase, mastering a willful blindness. And this is what it takes to commit an act against your conscience. You have to just simply, Steve opened up with this, have any of you cheated, lied, or stolen anything? And we could add self-deception into that mix. And then you talked about these people in the forest. It's really a powerful thing to think about. And you were talking about conscientious objection arising in the body and after the fact, in the body after the fact. So you've got somebody whose self disappears, who goes into the woods and self disappears. So that conscience, we've talked about it as a two-in-one phenomenon having to do with thinking, really thinking, and then you come to a moral conviction about something. But this is something entirely different. This is something where you kind of destroy yourself on the grounds of conscience, and it's a physical, it happens to you in a sense. And so all of these kinds of observations and insights that the three of you have made me think, this is more a comment than a question, I guess. A book written by a philosopher and literary critic named Kenneth Burke, who wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Religion. And it's a book in which he partly tries to talk about the ways in which we talk about God. And he comes to the conclusion that the only way in which we can talk about God is to speak negatively. We can talk about what God is not, but we can't talk about what God is. So you can talk about the infinite, so, in the immortality of God, it's also a negative thing, not mortal, not finite. And maybe when it comes down to it, conscience, we can only kind of narrow it down and get closer to that unity that Steve spoke about by at least trying to define what it isn't, what does not constitute conscience, which, again, it's a comment. I don't know if any of you have any reflections on that.
There's the comment. That's the angel. Well, one thing that I would say about, I think that the most damning words Steve spoke was that he was alone. Yes. That's damning not just of the other people in the military who were faced with this, had the same information and didn't side with you or didn't open a dialogue with you, but on the entire population, on journalists for sure, who didn't find the debate that was there or took 5 years to find it, Jane Mayer aside, and on all citizens. And in every story I tell in my book, it's what I try. I've often been asked since, well, you write about these exceptional people who took these stands. You can't expect ordinary people, despite the fact that they're disarmingly ordinary. You can't expect everyone to do these things. And what I say to that is true. You cannot expect that. But you can expect people to refrain from instantly dismissing or silencing or judging those who stand against, those who do raise their voices. That's a burden that I think falls on every citizen. And it's not such a high burden. You're not risking anything other than opening your ears to that alternative voice. And I guess the other thing I would say about the thing about your being alone that to me makes me more hopeful is that every act that I wrote about in my book started out, the person was alone for a long time. In the case of the first story, it's a Swiss police officer who allows Jews into Switzerland in 1938. He loses his job. He dies in 1972. It takes 21 years after that for the Swiss government to acknowledge that what he did was right. 7 efforts were denied before that. He died in poverty. His whole family was ashamed and all of this. And yet, this guy has changed Swiss history because he got the government, he finally did get rehabilitated, and his rehabilitation was an integral part of Switzerland re-examining its so-called neutrality during World War II, its refugee policy, in addition to its gold policy and so forth. So all these, what I say at the end is that these acts have ripple effects that last very long, but it's up to all of us to make sure that they happen.
Yeah, a quote I used to love, and it's been so long that I forgot, I'd like to attribute to the correct person, but it was something effective of trust those who are searching for the truth and suspect those who know it. And I think that's the same thing. I think after 2 days of a gathering like this, if we all walk away mystified about conscience, I think that's progress, not a regression. I think we all need to snip the bounds of our cultural, familial, national legacies of conscience and examine them freely, openly, and completely, so that we, in the future, we can respond, like I mentioned in my observation, so we can respond rather than react. Whatever our conscience is, I think our conscience tells us it should be our own, that we have consciously chosen the contents of that, because it's going to shape our behavior. And I think it was Professor Johnson mentioned, and correctly so, based on my reading. If you ask somebody about, okay, you flashed up 2 cars, which one do you like better? And people, I like that one. And then why? They'll come up with a long list. But you look at the neuroscience of it, it was a completely visceral response. That one's nice. But now I give time, well, this one has better horsepower, better gas mileage. But that did not factor into it. That's okay with cars. We can't afford to do that with our conscience. We need to be not a visceral reaction. It's based on reflection, on challenge, on discussion like we have here. Not, obviously everybody is fortunate as we are to gather like this, but over a glass of wine or beer or whatever it is, chessboard in a Bedouin tribe somewhere, to really struggle with these issues and until it makes sense. But here's one thing too. I'm going to be a very, very poor guest here because, first of all, I didn't properly thank everybody for allowing me to be part of this, and I'm probably made you regret that decision, so forgive me for that. But I think maybe we could spend this life and next finding out what we don't share. And I think maybe it may take a little while, but finally, if we could come up with one element of life, one value that we all share, and we all agree to put that in our conscience, I think that's maybe a positive first step. Just an idea.
I think sometimes it's necessary to stand in a space by oneself and make decisions. But also, I think it's also important to embrace mystery. And maybe that's what the individual faces in the final analysis anyway, is a certain kind of mystery, and willing to confront that mystery and come to certain decisions that are inside of oneself. Because if there's a room of 2 or 3, there's never really a consensus. We think about it.
So please join me in thanking the last panel of the day.